Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's Security Boulevard webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. I am just so excited about this webinar. I'm just very excited about it. Can't wait to get started. But before we do, if you have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you will have the opportunity to access it later. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out a link via email so that you can access the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions throughout today's webinar from the audience. So if you have a question at any time, please don't wait, don't hesitate, just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your questions, and we will try to get to as many as we can during the webinar. Also, at the end of the webinar, we are going to be doing a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So please stick around and hopefully you'll be one of our 4 big lucky winners. All right, with that, let's go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is Too Close to the Sunburst, a supply chain compromise. This is an immersive exercise and it is being held by Chris Pace, who is the technology advocate at Immersive Labs, and Kev Breen, who's the director of cyber threat research at Immersive Labs. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me as always. Great to see you both.
Thanks, Charlene. Great to be here.
Indeed.
Chris, you're going to be kicking us off, I know. So I'm going to take myself off camera, put myself on mute, and let you guys just dive right on into this, and we'll just give you as much time as possible. I'll see you on the other side.
Thank you so much, Charlene. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And to explain a little bit more about what's going to happen over the next 45 minutes or so. This is what we would call a cyber crisis scenario. And essentially what that means is we're going to walk through a real world-ish scenario based on real world events. And the idea is that the scenario will help us focus on how do we make decisions that balance risk, the kind of risk that we face as an organization, based on the available facts that we have to hand. How effectively can we investigate what's going on? How effectively can we see whether, in this case, a threat to our supply chain, how real is it, how much does it impact us, and then what's the outcome of those decisions. Now, the great thing about using Immersive Labs Cyber Crisis Sim for this exercise is that you, as attendees of the webinar, get to play along. So at the top of Kev's screen that he's sharing now, you will see a URL and an exercise code. You simply type that URL into your web browser on your PC or your mobile phone, and then you use that exercise code to log into the exercise. And essentially what this means is that you will be able to play along with us. We will collect your votes as we move through the scenario, so we'll be able to see perhaps where your views differ to ours, and you can use the questions pane as a place for us to for you to be able to either volunteer opinions or to ask questions, and so that is how you access the platform in order to play along with us. Okay, Kev, do you want to click the big blue button and we'll get started? So as I've said, we'll focus on making decisions that balance the risk to our organization based on the available facts. And attacks like Sunburst, which I'm sure you will all be familiar with, the compromise of that Solarwinds product, have shown that even the most secured and well-patched environments are at risk from cyber threats. And this scenario is inspired by those real life events. Kev, do you want to just bring our role into focus so that everybody can understand the position that we find ourselves in? So we work as Chief Information Security Officer for Cashmonia. You'll be pleased to know that all these names are invented. No real large financial services companies were harmed in the making of this scenario. We are a large US-based banking and financial services company. We're multinational, so we have employees all across the world. And as the CISO of Cashmonia, it's our job to work with the security professionals in our team to secure and respond to cyber threats. And of course, it's also our job to act as the bridge in communicating the potential impact to our CEO and to the board. So that's the role that we're going to take in this scenario. Obviously, keep that in mind as we're answering the questions, because of course, it's possible that the view that we might have as a security practitioner could be different to the view that we have as a Chief Information Security Officer. Kev is going to take the role of a security practitioner in this exercise. So there may be conflict between the two of us, which is sometimes imagined and sometimes real. Okay, next. So we're at the start of the exercise. We're just gonna have a quick look and see how many people we've got. Oh, a good number of people in that, so that's good. So we start the exercise. We're looking forward to time off. It's holiday season, and just hours before the holiday starts, we receive a threat intelligence briefing. The renowned cybersecurity company ICE knows. See what we did there? No prizes for guessing what we've done, but there's no Amazon gift card for guessing that we've done a very bad job of changing a name, has released an advisory, and they are alerting users that a network management software, Mars version 3.01, has been compromised by a highly effective threat actor group who have opened a back door into the product. Now, we know that we have this software installed on a host in our network where it's used to manage both network and domain services. What should we do? So we're going to reveal the options here. Kev is going to open up the voting. You can join in with the voting at any time, so please don't hesitate. URL and exercise code, as always, at the top of the screen. So option 1, do we find out how embedded this appliance is in our operations? How involved is this software with our day-to-day operations? Is it highly active? Option 2, do we find out how much credential access it has? Do we know which other parts of our network and cloud infrastructure this software is potentially talking to? Do we find out if it's able to talk to the internet? Can't talk out to the internet, becomes less of a problem for us, and Kev, I'll ask you to maybe explain that in a moment. Or do we just turn it off? This is clearly a big security problem. Let's just shut it down. So Kev, first of all, let me come to you, and if I'm taking the role of the CISO, all our attendees are taking the role of the CISO. The first question I'm going to ask is about, my appetite for risk. If I think this is a big enough risk, surely I can just turn it off, remove that risk, and we've covered ourselves. What are the potential ramifications of me just going straight for option 4 to turn it off?
I mean, and again, that's your default position, is it? If this is that compromised, then turn it off. Like, what's the damage that can be done by turning it off? But we might not understand how embedded this is. If we have a really large infrastructure and this is a vital part of that infrastructure, of managing it and maintaining it, we could end up turning this off, and that might cascade things out. So we might end up turning off large portions of our infrastructure just by turning this one appliance off. So before we make any kind of knee-jerk reaction, we need to understand exactly where this sits, how this sits, and how it operates. It might just be a demo installation that we're on trial and doesn't have anything, or it might be really deeply embedded. And I think we need to understand that before we just panic.
I think I understand why option 2 is a challenge, because basically we're saying if it has access to other parts of the network that it's using credentials for, that adds a risk of lateral movement, right? If someone's able to get in, then they can use that access to move around. So that bit I understand. Why does it matter whether it can talk to the internet or not? And why is it less of a problem if it's not talking out to the internet?
So this comes from the advisory. So
okay.
This is a supply chain compromise. So what we're being told here is not that we've been attacked and somebody's broken into our networks. What we're being told is that something inside our network is talking out to the attackers. And they're doing that through a compromised piece of software they've built a backdoor into. So if this host is unable to talk to the internet at all, if it has no route, then it's potentially still compromised in terms of having the backdoor installed, but it's not had any opportunity to connect to the attacker's infrastructure, which means that actually the attackers cannot have done anything on that device. So that's also an interesting point to consider.
Okay, and so if we go back to kind of when we set the scenario right at the start, I suppose, the available facts that we have to hand here, this question is kind of asking us, what facts do you care about most in terms of the order of priority? Also, it's important to remember that many of the decisions that we're going to make through this scenario are kind of condensing down the first maybe 30 minutes to an hour of what happens during a situation like this. So it can feel can feel quite drawn out, but actually it's quite a lot of stuff happening over quite a short period of time. Okay, we've had 24 people vote. Kev, why don't we take a look at how the audience voted? Okay, so most of our audience gone with finding out how embedded it is. I think, Kev, that sort of echoes what you were saying about having a better understanding of what it's doing in our network. So that's good. Let's choose that option and show the impact. Now, one of the things that the cyber crisis scenarios allow us to do is to essentially, and this exercise, by the way, has been created by me. I've built it inside the software, and what it allows you to do is it allows you to add these kind of indicators. These could be indicators of risk, they could be your share price, they could be customer confidence. They're designed to give the player a view of of the things that their decision has affected as we move through the exercise, and I'll talk about them in more detail as we go through. That was a good answer. It is vital that we understand how heavily used and interconnected that compromised software is. So let's see what happens next as the situation evolves and determines what we decide to do next. Okay, so we've decided not to make any rash decisions. The CISO hasn't prevailed in just switching it off. We're taking a breath. IT operations tell us that this device is core to managing our network. It connects to all our Cisco devices, so our routers and VPNs, and it also has access to the domain controllers. Ironically, this rogue update, fixes a security vulnerability, but do we know that we have that affected version? At this point, should we take any action? So, Kev, let's see what our options are. I am keeping an eye on the questions pane, so if you want to throw questions in there for us, then please do, and I'll get to them as and when. I can see one in there that I am about to ask you in a moment, Kev, but let's first of all take a look at our available options. So option 1 is prevent the NMS from communicating with the internet. This will mean that we aren't connected to any attacker infrastructure. Option 2, further investigate using the available indicators of compromise. There are already some open source resources out there that could help us to understand more. Option 3, roll back. We might be able to continue using the NMS security by rolling it back to a pre-patch state. Or option 4, simply turn it off. It clearly isn't worth the risk. We should just shut it down now. So we have learned that it's fairly, in fact, very embedded in our organization. It's clearly something that we're using regularly. It's connected to important parts of our infrastructure. We don't yet know, it appears, whether we have an affected version or not. So, Kev, what's your instinct? I mean, again, I think you've made clear to me that it's just simply not worth turning it off. That adds too much other risk. But now it feels like rolling back to a pre-patch state would be the sort of standard thing that we would do in this situation in order to protect ourselves. Are there any reasons why that wouldn't be effective?
Yeah, and again, so this is something we got from the initial advisory, where it really sets this kind of exploit attack, this attack sequence apart from everything else we've seen. So in a more traditional exploit, you have the attacker exploiting a vulnerability against your systems and they gain access to you. So if that was the case, then rolling back would be a potentially viable option, because if they haven't already compromised us, then rolling back might put us to a state where they can't attack us. Unfortunately, this is the inside talking out, which means it's already happened. And the advisory told us, as we start to reveal more information, as we start to go deeper into it, the advisory told us that actually this patch came out several months ago. So it isn't something that happened today or yesterday. This is now several months old. So at this point, rolling back isn't going to make any difference to us in terms of any potential damage the attacker's already taken.
Okay. I mean, it feels like then the thing that we care about is whether the indicators, whether the indicators of compromise that exist that match up with what we're seeing on the inside. But before we get to that, a question that's come in from the audience is what sort of, kind of know the answer to this already because Kevin and I have already discussed, but what sort of measures could have prevented an attack like Sunburst? And I suppose I need to give you clarity on the question. If you can talk from both sides, so if you can talk first of all about the nature of the supply chain compromise, and then talk about for organizations that actually have Sunburst installed, SolarWinds installed, because of course, that's the whole nub of the threat in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like from an organizational perspective of having SolarWinds installed, there's nothing you could have done to prevent this kind of attack. It was really well executed by the attacker. So to look at it from the SolarWinds perspective, so what happened is a sophisticated threat actor gained access to the SolarWinds build server. And there's still a lot of technical detail missing around all of that. But they gained access to the SolarWinds build server and they injected a malicious DLL into a very specific sequence as part of those builds. And we'll take a closer look at that shortly. And the attackers did it in such a way that everything they did was designed to stay under the radar. So the naming conventions, the code that was used was all designed to make it look really legitimate, even going so far as not obfuscating, not using any of the traditional malware techniques to try and make it look legitimate. So from that perspective, SolarWinds definitely had some things they could have done to protect their infrastructure, to recognize this was happening. But from an organization that has SolarWinds installed that was affected by this, there was very little you could have done in order to prevent this. Identifying it is slightly different. This thing was talking to the internet very cleverly, very hard to detect, but there are some things you could have done to kind of mitigate or identify that. But at the highest of levels, not a lot of things would have prevented you from this.
Okay, so we've got plenty of votes in. Let's have a look at what the responses are. As I always say when we're doing these exercises, there are no right or wrong answers. There is really just the decisions that are made using the available intelligence. I always like to tell the story at this point about basically how, you know, even the word crisis, the root of the word crisis, is to do with decisions. It's not to do with bad things happening. It's to do with what decisions need to be made. Okay, so our audience have gone for option 2, to investigate further using available indicators of compromise, and that's good because there's an extra bit of bonus content that comes with that option. So okay, so let's move on to that. So our SOC and incident response teams have investigated further using the IOCs. At this point, I'm going to hand over to Kev, and this is where perhaps you could have argued up to now this is very similar to a sort of traditional tabletop exercise, but at this point, Kev is now going to launch a lab as part of Immersive Labs, and this is where we're trying to kind of join together the idea of a traditional tabletop exercise, which is undertaken by perhaps a crisis management team or an incident management team who are making decisions at the very top level. Whilst also involving those with the technical skills that will mostly be called on during an incident if it were to happen. And this is designed to add a kind of layer of realism into these kinds of exercises. So Kev, I'm going to hand over to you at this point. This is basically a lab that is going to enable us to use the IOCs that are available to see whether this is a thing that affects our network.
Yeah, exactly that. So for a little bit of context, and again, one of the things that happens as you're going through these kinds of incidents and these crises, and like Chris said, especially in that first 30-minute window, your security teams are still gathering information. And one of the things that happened very early on was a set of indicators of compromise were released. So in this specific in our scenario, we're talking about IceNose. In this lab, we're looking specifically at the ones released by FireEye. So we're looking at the real malware, the actual SolarWinds exploit, and we're looking at the real IOCs that were released by FireEye very early on after this announcement came out. And what this is going to allow us to do is, with a almost 100% degree of certainty, identify whether we have a vulnerable or a potentially backdoored version. So like we said, there was a very specific version that was released that had the backdoor installed in it. And we have a set of Yara rules which will only match against strings that exist within there, within patterns that exist within that very specific DLL. And there was a lot of work done when releasing these IOCs to reduce the false positive rate. So what we're looking at here is, as a SOC analyst, there's a couple of ways we would have done this in the real world. We might have deployed Yara against the host, or we might have grabbed the files that we know we want to check and then brought them to another analyst machine, which is what we've done in this instance. So we've grabbed the files that were indicated as part of the exploit, which you can see here. So the business layer DLL, apply 606 DLL, and this other DLL down here. These were all indicated in the report, and they all, well, the business layer is the legitimate DLL by name, so we can go and grab that. And then what we can do is we can have a look at the countermeasures. And in here we've got a set of snort rules that are looking for the network traffic, which we could run if we've got things like full packet capture. In this instance, we're just looking to see whether we've got that infected version. So I can run Yara, all of those Yara rules, and I'm going to run that against the business layer DLL. And what I've got here is I've got that for this file has matched 4 of the known indicators within that file. So from this, I can be extremely confident that the SolarWinds host in my network does indeed contain the vulnerable exploit. And we'll get into what that actually means a little bit later. But one of the other things I'll do from here is I will take those file hashes, I will go and look them up on VirusTotal, do some of that open source intelligence. Like I said, this isn't just affecting us. FireEye have done a lot of release, so there's a lot of open source information that I can start to pull in to really understand what the impact against my network is, or the potential.
Yeah. Great. Okay, we have had someone ask, is there a way of getting access to that lab that Kev was doing? Yes, you can visit community.immersivelabs.online and create an account. You'll get access to all the Sunburst labs in there. If you're already an Immersive Labs customer, I think it's in cyber threat intelligence, but you'll find it anyway. Okay, so let's see. So we now know that we have an affected version. We also now know that at this moment, CISA have released a statement and they are advising government organizations to turn off the software. They are saying affected version should be powered down or removed from networks. So what do we do now? What are our options? Okay, so obviously I'm going to be keen on option 1. The government is now telling us to turn it off. Surely that means we have to turn it off. Option 2, remove the software. We can just uninstall it from the host. Option 3, prevent it from communicating with the internet. At least we then would know that it wasn't communicating with any malicious infrastructure. Or do we continue to gather basic intelligence on the threat actor? Although CISA is suggesting that government agencies remove the software, we don't know that we're even a target for this. And in fact, it feels a little bit like we might already have an inkling that we're not a target. So Kevin, again, you know, I'm leaning to this sort of feels like it's gathering severity, but perhaps you can tell me that it's not gathering severity.
I think both. It's hard because both of those things are true. So SolarWinds came out and they said that 18,000 organizations were in the right band at the right time to have downloaded the security update. The other really important piece of information that came out is that the threat actor was very selective about their targets. And this was part of that staying under the wire. So of those 18,000 installations that happened, only about 250 of them, and maybe a little bit more today, have actually had the attackers go in and take any form of action. So this is where we get into that weird place between we were vulnerable, yes, there is a backdoor installed, but nothing may have happened. The attackers may not have done anything. They might not have cared about us at all. And this is where we get into those really hard, risky decisions to make, because we could like panic and like make another knee-jerk reaction, or we could slow down, gather more information, and then make a more informed decision. Like we said, this thing's been installed for months, and the attackers have had access for a long time. So taking another 20 minutes, another half an hour to gather more information isn't necessarily going to cause significant amounts of damage.
Yeah, and that's a factor, isn't it? Because of course there is this, we are however many injects, we're 3 injects in now, and there is a possibility that because we feel we haven't taken any action, we haven't flicked any switches or pulled any plugs, and so there is a feeling that, well, maybe we're not responding. We're supposed to be responding to the incident, and maybe by not switching it off or not unplugging something or not disconnecting something, that we're not doing what we should be doing. I think it's really important that you make that point, that if we weigh up both the balance of risk and also what we already understand about our situation, is we've been in this situation for quite a long time. So actually a little bit longer is not going to make all that much difference. Let's see what the audience have to say. I'm leaning towards continuing with information gathering, but let's see what the audience have to say. They agree with us again, and I think some of this is because although CISA have given advice to government agencies, that's not the same as us. We are we're a financial services company, and again, this comes back to what's our risk appetite as as the organisation that exists in our industry, facing this particular threat. Okay, let's move to the next.
Yeah, sorry, I just want to pull attention to option 1. So option 1, turn it off now. That's potentially an incredibly damaging option to take. So if we were to turn that device off, there's a potential we've just lost a load of forensics data. We've lost RAM, we've lost potential file system things, so we could actually be doing more damage by turning that off. So in those instances, I would always go more towards the disconnect it from the network, like not just the internet, but disconnect it from the entire network, and then physically have somebody go from your response team, collect disk images, collect memory images. So turning it off is, again, it's one of those snap decisions that's easy to make in the heat of the moment, but you can actually do yourself further damage down the line by making those snap decisions.
Okay, so let's see what's next. Okay, so as you can see from the indicators on the right hand side there, that's obviously lifted up the available intel. It's also somewhat increased our risk appetite, because obviously by not taking Kev's action, we've decided we're ready to absorb some of that risk for now, and that's been balanced with the fact that it's been doing this for months anyway. So we've made a decision on the balance of risk. Okay, so our threat intelligence team has now provided us with a brief summary of what they know about this threat so far, and that is that victims have included government, consulting, technology, telecoms, and extractive entities. And I'll fill everyone in. I didn't know until recently, in fact, until I read this report, that extractive entities basically means energy or oil and gas in North America, Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. So financial services not in that list. This actor prefers to maintain a light malware footprint, and Kev can talk probably in a bit of detail about what that actually means in a moment. The compromised DLL from the software on our network is beaconing. So, and again, I'll ask Kevin in a moment to explain what we mean by beaconing, but this is something that's triggered automatically when the backdoored software is installed. And so it's been doing that for around 7 months. Essentially, we have been compromised for around 7 months. So what should we do next? Kev, you've also got a lab to show us here, and I'm assuming this is now going to dive into a little more detail about what this file is actually doing.
Yeah, so we have another lab here. So we saw in the first one, we pulled those indicators of compromise out. We used them to identify that we do in fact have a malicious version of that DLL file. And what this next lab does is it takes that a step further. I'm not going to get too deep into this one on this webinar because this will take several hours potentially to go through this, but I'm just going to give a highlight of what this lab enables you to do as part of this kind of investigation.
Yeah, and
So
also
what we've
helps you
got,
to understand that. Sorry, Kev. Also helps you understand that, like, the using the content in the context of an exercise like this, you can go as like light or as deep as you like. This is going into analysis of the thing itself. If that's a thing that you've got, people in or amongst your team who are able to do that, then it could be worthwhile as part of the exercise. So it's all about deciding like what are the ways that you want to use the available content, and that's designed to exercise. Do you have the right skills in the right places in order to be able to respond to something like this? Sorry, Kev.
yeah, exactly. So again, as more information starts to be released, as we go more into the technical indicators of release, so as well as indicators of compromise, there were some very quick write-ups on what this malware's capabilities are. And as part of that, the reports indicated there was a domain generation algorithm as part of this malware. So one of the things that it does is that once you install the update, it immediately, or not, once you've installed the update, the DLL file immediately comes into play. And the DLL file, as part of that attempting to stay hidden, will actually sleep for a period of days. So it picks a random number of days and then sleeps for that long before it then tries to connect out to the attacker's infrastructure. When it connects out to the attacker's infrastructure, it generates a very unique domain per organization. So one of the things we can do is we can take the DLL file, we can open it up in some free open source tooling called DNspy in this instance, and we can go through, we can identify that domain generation algorithm, we can reverse engineer how it works, and then we can pre-generate what our domains would have looked like. And we can then take that over to the network team, and we can go, this is what the domain would have looked like. Can we go back through the logs and see what kind of activity has gone out? And that's going to give us an indication of whether we were deeply compromised or not. If we see that there's like a background polling, so something consistent, like once every hour, it's sending like one very small piece of information, that tells us it's beaconing, but maybe not being actively used. If we're seeing lots of traffic between these hosts and that network, then we can say with a higher degree of certainty that we have been compromised. And that's what this lab's designed to do. So we'll walk you through how to identify where the process starts, what the initialization looks like. So here we can see we've got that section that's looking at when it wants to launch. We've got the block list of things that it's looking to block, and then we've got the algorithm that's used as part of that DGA. So we can come in through here and you've got all the tools you need provided in the lab to go and reverse engineer that, so you can actually pull out all this information. These labs have...
Sorry, Kev, it just seemed a good opportunity to the intelligence told us that the threat actor in this case is like to adopt a light touch approach, I think it said. Can you explain what that means and how that's different to perhaps some other kinds of threats? Like what's different about what you might see here versus what you might see on a more traditionally infected system, for example?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different techniques that attackers play with, and when they're building malware, one of the things they typically want to do is they want to avoid detection. So they want to avoid things like automated antivirus, they want to avoid endpoint detection and host-based intrusion. They want to avoid all those things. And malware analysts and AV vendors and EDR vendors, they've known the techniques that malware use for a while now. So malware authors will typically use obfuscation or encryption as methods of hiding their code from more simple things like static string analysis. Now, those obfuscation techniques themselves, they make it hard for arguably make it harder for machines to recognize patterns. But as an analyst manually looking at it, obfuscation stands out a mile. You can definitely see when code has been obfuscated. And if I can probably give a quick example of that here. So if I load this DLL file in and just open this DLL file. So if I have a look at this isn't all malware. A part of this is actually legitimate code, and then the attackers have added some extra code into it, which they've done in here. But if you go through the code the attackers added, you don't see any signs of obfuscation. You can see that they use exactly the same naming convention. So if I can find the Orion Improvement business layer. So this is the code that was written by the malware authors themselves. And as you can see, and I appreciate that to some people this may already look like a bit of gibberish, but we can see there are recognizable strings in here. Whereas more traditional malware might obfuscate the string. So the attackers took a lot of deliberate steps in order to make this thing look as legitimate as they could.
And it does obviously still work. It does obviously still work. It still does the job that SolarWinds is supposed to do. So it's already hiding pretty well by doing that.
Exactly that. And they went a step further. So that malicious outbound traffic was designed to mimic EC2 URLs, so mimic AWS URLs, and the actual way they were posting the data was designed to mimic the Orion traffic itself. So a lot of actions were taken. And the other part of the small footprint is once the attackers had access to this box, they didn't then go launch lots of custom malware. There were some custom malware like Teardrop was used, but they went with a lot of hands-on, what we call living off the land attack cycles. So they're using PowerShell, they're using legitimate administrative tools to gain further credentialed access and to move laterally. The idea being that it's a lot harder to tell an admin's actions against an attacker using admin actions. So it's another way for them to stay hidden just underneath those obvious signs of detection. By like deploying ransomware, super noisy, really easy to spot once it starts. So these things, they've taken a lot of principles to try and stay as under the radar as they could.
Yeah, and obviously that worked.
It did for a significant number of people. Like I said, this was running in organizations for several months before they even realized. So even companies like FireEye, and FireEye are arguably at the towards the top of their game, this was running inside their networks for several months with attackers active before they recognized it, which again brings us back to normal organizations would really have struggled to identify this kind of attack. It was really well prepared, planned, and executed. So kudos to the attackers for that, I suppose.
Okay, let's head back to our scenario then. So essentially, what we've learned is that we have that DLL in the compromised version of the software. It's been there for a long time. Okay, what are we going to do? What are we going to do next? What are our available options? Okay, we can either take the risk and leave it running. This intelligence implies that the threat actor is highly unlikely to have us in their sights. We can deploy extra security controls. The amount of credentialed access that it has is our biggest concern. So let's enforce wholesale password changes. Or now is the moment that we decide to turn it off. Even if being breached is unlikely, we should do everything that we can to protect ourselves. We have to take it down. So I suppose I could say that if it's already been active inside the network for 7 months, it's likely that I don't want to make too many assumptions, but it's likely that SolarWinds will be looking at finding some way of deploying a fix that will deal with this in fairly short order. So option one is not actually as not as drastic as it seems, given that we've been compromised this whole time up to now. Option two, though, it gives us an action to take, And B, also feels good from the point of view of mitigating risk. You know, the last couple of decisions that we've made, they've really amped up our appetite for risk. And I'm now starting to feel maybe there's something that we should do to look to balance, particularly that credentialed access. When you've been talking about lateral movement, you've been saying all the words that have made me go a little shivery, like lateral movement and you know, using credentials to move to other places. That gives me a concern. So I'm leaning more towards option 2. I'm going to ask you as my technical expert, Kev, are there any reasons why I would pick option 1 over option 2?
This early at this stage, I don't see why you would. As part of the Caesar advisory, when they first came out and said, like, turn it off, disconnect it from the network, they also said that you are not to install updates coming from SolarWinds.
Right, because we don't know if they're compromised.
Yeah, SolarWinds did release a patch that would uninstall that DLL and replace it with the legitimate one. But, I mean, it's fair to say that the confidence in SolarWinds at this moment in time is incredibly low. So I'm not going to trust coming from there. Okay. Leaving it running. The thing about leaving it running, people would say, like, we're not a target. It's already been running for 7 months. So what's the danger? The danger is not knowing the threat actor enough. It is entirely possible that when they got burnt, when they got outed, they could go full on destruction. They could deploy ransomware, they could destroy wipers, and this is a network management solution. This is designed, which we already saw in the scenario, it's talking to all of my routers, it's talking to my domain controller. Like, the attacker could go full destructive and do significant damage by leaving it there. So I'd see nothing that would leave us at option 1.
Okay, let's have a look and see what the audience think. That's all very insightful. Okay, that's good. They're with us. The option 2 is definitely my favored one. So let's go for that. Yeah, given that we understand enough about how the threat actor works and the importance of lateral movement, any measure that helps mitigate that is a step in the right direction. Okay, let's see where that leaves us, having made that change. Okay, we have another problem. One of the passwords that we just changed is used with a VPN config script via our group policy. Now parts of our cache operations, which use this VPN for secured access, are currently unable to connect in order to process transactions. This is a classic knock-on. Right, so what should we do now? Let's see what our options are. Okay, so we can deploy resources from our IT operations team to make the fix. That involves manually making the change to the password in a number of different places. That feels to me already like it's going to have an impact on our operational effectiveness. Option 2, we can roll back that single password change. It's an single quick fix, but it does undo the security benefits. Or we can put up with it for now. Again, this is too much of a hit on operational, but put up with it for now. Security has to take precedence. We can fix this once we understand what we're really dealing with. So it feels like we have 3 options that have different kind of weightings of importance. We can either use our IT resource to ensure that security change remains intact, or option 2, we can roll back the single password change, which is quick, but will remove any security benefit that we got from it. Or option 3, we can just put up with it and have the security in place, but we've got cache operations who are struggling to do their job, which obviously is important to our business. So Kev, I'm going to look to you from a security perspective. You are going to always go for option 2. Option 1.
Yeah, with my security head on, I'm not thinking about the impact to operations. I'm thinking about the potential impact to security and the confidentiality, integrity of all of our assets. So I'm going with, just like call in, like authorize the overtime, get the IT department on it. They're going to be sat in calls with users, doing manually updates to get them connected. That's going to be where my head takes me straight to.
Yeah.
Like you say, the point of running these exercises is to bring the team together. So it's about taking all those viewpoints. So somebody from operations saying, actually, that's going to cost us $3,000 every minute. Like, we've got examples in the real world where people have said, like, taking their SAP systems offline would cost you $1,000 every minute in loss of revenue. So there is significant operational impact and financial impact that can have. So you have to balance the security risk against the risk of doing nothing.
Yeah, the other thing is we could deploy resources from IT to fix it now, but given that that is quite an involved job for them to do, we don't know where we might need that resource somewhere else as we make our way through the rest of this incident. So that's why I was so naturally gravitated towards option 2, although it's unfortunate to have to undo a security change. It feels like, to maintain our operational effectiveness, I would be going for option 2. But let's see what the audience have to say. It'd be interesting to see if this is the moment where we diverge. It is. That's really interesting. So again, as the CISO, I am I'm balancing risk against against operational effectiveness of the business, against security. So that's why I've chosen option 2. So let's go option 2. It's really interesting how there were still 6 people who are ready to just not worry about it and leave it alone. Okay, we never want to undo a change that has been made to increase security. The impact on our business operations would have been too great to bear. It's most likely you would look at allocating resources to making that change more gracefully when some valuable resources are available. But I felt like at this moment in time they weren't available, and so therefore I didn't want to make that decision to invest those resources in that place. That's the first place where we disagreed, everyone, but it's okay. Like I said, there are no wrong answers, except you all gave the wrong answer. No, I'm kidding. Okay, next. Right, we've dealt with the password issue, but we still have a hacked DLL beaconing from our network management system. But what does this really mean? We know for sure that the software is compromised, but that isn't the same as us having been breached. Is the potential that we could be further compromised a good enough reason to take down an integral part of our network? What should we do? The reason I think that we ask ourselves this question at this part in the scenario, at this moment in the scenario, is that pressure will come to bear from other places while this thing remains active in our network, that we should do something. We've done enough investigating now. We should take some action. And so really the idea of this particular part of the scenario is to kind of introduce that idea of pressure coming to bear potentially from other places across the business, that we should take some action, make something happen. And so these are the options that we have here now. So we can either turn it off, we can do nothing. So we can just basically say, look, we can sit tight until we can make an update that we know that we can rely upon, or we ramp up our investigation. Now, Kev, what is, I can kind of already know what your answer is going to be, but share it with the group anyway, and then I will explain to you why we're going to choose the wrong answer.
Yeah, so at this point, we're seeing lots more news articles coming out, lots more organizations are indicating that they may have been compromised this, and we've got more technical detail coming out. So with all of that extra really rich intelligence, my device is still on, like I've got that intelligence, I've got extra logging in place, I've got the DJs, I want to go find out what happened. So let's figure out if there was lateral movement, if they did something 6 months ago, if they did something 7 months ago that fell out of my log retention period, then I might be able to identify something laterally. So I'm all about, like, put more resource into threat hunting. Let's look at everywhere they could be and see if we can correlate anything from the NMS across any potential high value targets.
Whereas from the CISO perspective, I'm looking at option 1 maybe and thinking, even if it just removes a fraction of risk, we could carry on doing that investigation whilst at the same time kind of removing that as a factor. Almost in a way, we've kind of got a dormant weapon sat in the middle of our network, and I'm thinking, the most basic thing I could do is diffuse it. That will reduce, even the tiniest of risks of something happening. this is sort of a no-win question, because if we decide to ramp up our investigation, we could potentially learn very little, but also turning it off feels potentially destructive and could have ramifications. But let's have a look and see how the audience have voted. And while we're looking at the votes, we've had a question come in about the installer package specifically. So how was the installer package? I think I actually know the answer to this, but I'll let you answer it, Ken. How was the installer? I've talked about this so much that I think I actually might know the answer. How was the installer package digitally signed after the hackers had modified the DLL? Could SolarWinds have detected this if they'd had some controls around the source code or the patching package? And I think you're going to talk about basically how a build server works now.
Yeah, and again, it was I want to say at least 2 weeks before we had all of the detail around exactly how SolarWinds are compromised. So this was a digitally signed DLL. It was packaged inside a signed and hashed update package that was distributed through the legitimate methods. What the attackers actually did is they put a small tool in place that was monitoring the build server commands that were actually running. And they waited for a very specific set of build instructions to be initiated. And what they did is they did a live switch of the source code at that point in time. So the attackers had their malicious DLL, which was the legitimate DLL with some extra code inserted into it. And what they did is they didn't touch the source code at all. They did this inside the build server. So at the point the build server command was issued, they did a live switch of the code that compiled against the bad DLL. And then as soon as that was done, like you look at your source code, full source code review, it exactly matches what you expected. It would only be if you decompiled the resulting file and then compared the two together that you would have had any chance at identifying this in that instance. Now, the one thing I will say is they could have done some things to look for this. So if they'd have had something like endpoint detection on the build server, everybody puts endpoint detection on like web servers, SQL servers. They put them on your hosts. Very few people think to put that kind of protection onto your build servers. That may have picked this up. I'm not going to say it would have done. I'm not going to say that's the single saving grace that would have saved them, but that may have given them some indication that something was going wrong. But the attackers really sophisticated in the way they did this. They made sure not to touch the source code so that developers wouldn't spot it. They did it right in the middle of the build server. So yeah.
Okay, we have to move on because we're coming up against the end of the time. We've got a couple more, at least one more question to answer. So yeah, I'm going to choose the wrong answer because it's more interesting for the purposes of the storyline. You're about to find out why. So I'm going to decide to turn it off as a CISO. It's clearly not a good answer. It doesn't take into account the potential knock-on effect. And so therefore, next. We have now been told that we have a CVE with CVSS score 8.9 for our Cisco routers. So this is bad. A number of routers that we have on our network are currently vulnerable, and this is already being exploited. We need to install a patch, and we would usually use the network management software that we just turned off. So what do we do now? What are our available options here, Kev? First of all, 8.9. So obviously I care about things like ratings. Is 8.9 like severe or like I forget how they work, but is it critical essentially?
It's right on that edge. So it's like 7 to 8.9 is your high, 9 to 10 critical. So we are 0.1 away
literally
from
right
being critical.
Okay, well, look, these are our options. We can either leave the routers unpatched, we have our hands full, we have to deprioritize it. We can manually apply the patch. It's still a pretty serious risk. We could just get the patch out manually, or we could turn the NMS back on, which will, to be less time intensive than doing it manually. But again, opens us to the potential risk. Kev, I've made a bad decision. What happens now? Is it best to just turn the NMS back on and push the patch out? Are there risks inherent with that, or are we better to just manually apply it? I don't feel like we can leave it unpatched if it's critical.
Absolutely, yeah. We have to update these routers. Like this is critical, and this CV would have been public, so we're going to see a lot of automated attacks start to come in very quickly. we cannot turn the NMS back on. We've got no confidence in what's there. We know the attackers have got really good at compromising build packages and build servers. The NMS acts in a very similar way. It is responsible for sending updates to our devices. The attackers could have backdoored a Cisco firmware so that if we were to patch our Cisco devices, we're now patching compromised firmware across our estate to give the attacker a backdoor. So manual all the way is the only viable option here from my perspective.
Yeah, and it felt like it was serious enough from both the point of view of the CVSS score, but also the fact that we've seen exploits in the wild. That really was the tipping point for me. Okay, so let's see what the audience have to say. We've all gone with basically the right answer. So let's share it. But that was fun because it shows during these scenarios you can throw curveballs and create some interesting situations. Okay, as Kev said, we don't know what using the NMS might have meant for applying that patch. Next one, I think we're nearly there. Okay, we received an email from the FBI. They're basically telling us that we were compromised, so our network has been breached. We are now seeing lots of other organizations saying they were also breached, and that only leaves us with one option left, and that option is to continue our investigation. So Kev, you can close the voting off on that, and we can end the exercise. I feel good that I left Charlene enough time right at the end to do her housekeeping bits and pieces. That brings us to the end of the scenario. Thank you so much to all of you who took the time to join in and vote along with us. Thanks to everyone who asked questions, and hopefully that's excited you about the idea of running exercises like this in your own organization. Charlene, over to you.
Yeah, well, I feel really bad because I made you guys rush the last two, and I feel like I'm sorry about that. But yes, we do have a few things that I do need to close today's webinar out with. So I do want to thank you guys for such a great presentation. I just love these exercises. They are so informative and lots of fun just to follow along with. So thanks so much. I do want to remind the audience that today's event has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of it, or if you just want to watch it again, you will have the opportunity to do so. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And the webinar is also going to be on the Security Boulevard website, so you can go look for it there. Just go to securityboulevard.com/webinars, look in the on-demand section, and it should be right there waiting for you. Also, I did mention at the top of the hour, we'd be doing a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get that done. Our first winner today is Isabella L. Congratulations, Isabella. Our second winner today is Beatrice J. Congratulations, Beatrice. Third winner today is Caleb K. Congratulations, Caleb. And our final winner today is Paul H. Congratulations, Paul. We'll be following up with all 4 of you by email to get your Amazon gift card over to you. So please check your inbox. If you don't see your a message from us in your inbox, please check your spam folder. And guys, for anybody who did submit a question that didn't get answered during today's exercise, please note that the folks at Immersive Labs are getting a copy of all the questions that came in. And I am sure that they'll be more than happy to follow up with you and get your question answered, or to follow up on any comments that you did provide as well. So Chris and Kevin, thank you both so much for a great webinar. As always, we need to do this more often because they're just so much fun. Let's do more.
Indeed, thank you very much.
Okay, all right, good. All right, no pressure, no pressure. All right, I also want to thank the audience for joining me today. We've had such fun today, and I do appreciate everybody's time, and especially the expertise of Chris and Kevin in today's exercise, and also the time of the audience for joining us today. This is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm now signing off. Have a great day, everybody, and please stay safe.